today. The first one will be Laura Edwards. She's with the South Dakota State University, but is the state climatologist for South Dakota. And that'll be followed by Brian Fuchs down in Lincoln, Nebraska, University of Nebraska, at the National Drought Mitigation Center. Laura is going to address current, past, and future, potentially future drought outlooks, and she'll talk a little bit about impacts across the area. And then Brian is going to really concentrate on the Drought Monitor for the most part, doing some details on, giving some details on how that's put together, and some of the thought processes behind that, and maybe even how people can be a little more involved. A couple things we're asking of you as we get started here, if you will. Please, we don't have this meeting method doesn't have a great way to keep track of
grassland fire danger for the following areas in South Dakota.
Can you take me off hold? Whoever just put me on hold.
The Hermosa foothills and the Piedmont foothills.
Oh yeah. So if you are calling in by phone, please mute your phones.
Yeah, mute. Don't hold. Whatever you do.
Don't hold.
Especially if you're a weather forecast office, then we know where you're from. We will come after you. So if you would please type in your name and your organization and maybe a contact email or a phone number or both if you like in the chat box. We're just trying to keep track of that, and that's about the only way we're going to be able to do that. And that's helpful for us and potentially for you if we need to get back in touch with you. It's for some reason. Okay. At the end of all of this, we will open it up for questions or comments. You know, people are you know, if there's things that we're missing or whatever, we'd love to hear from you as far as that goes. We'll be recording this for various reasons, and we'll get that'll be the other reason we need to do this, get your names and contact information. So we'll be recording this and putting it, Brian, you can speak up here, putting it on the National Drought Mitigation website?
Yeah, we can, what we'll do is we'll compile the recording and the PowerPoints from today. We'll post it on the National Drought Mitigation webpage, and I'll send out a link of some sort, and Laura can probably do that as well on the South Dakota page. Okay.
So one way or the other, it'll be on a couple different websites for people to go, and if you know other people who will want to hear this or whatever, you can point them in that direction, or if you just want to go back and listen to it again. My name is Doug Cluck. I work for NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration out of Kansas City, Missouri, and I do want to say that USDA, National Drought Mitigation Center, South Dakota Extension, NIDIS, which is part of NOAA, the National Integrated Drought Information System, and a whole host of people, including state climate offices from North Dakota and Wyoming and Montana, really had a lot of information, as well as state folks that we're working with, that they gave us an incredible amount of information that hopefully we'll be covering some of in this presentation. So thank you very much to all the partners and everybody else who kind of chipped in with their help. Also thanks to the Weather Service who provided us information. I think that's enough. Nothing is being shared. Oh, here we go. We're bringing up the first presentation. The first presenter again is Laura Edwards, and Laura, I'm just going to have you take it away. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that opening slide there.
Yep.
Looks good, Laura.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, everybody. My name is Laura Edwards, and I am the South Dakota State Climatologist. I'm based out of Aberdeen, South Dakota, in the northeastern part of the state, and I work for SDSU Extension. So I'll be giving kind of a current status, maybe update. I know many of you in the region are already well aware of the impacts that we've already experienced, and I know it's a really tough situation out there, especially for our agricultural folks in the Dakotas, Montana especially. And so I'll be focusing mostly on that here today. And as Doug said, too, I'll get into the outlook here a little bit towards the end of the slides I have.
Hey, Laura, before
yeah.
you continue, do you have your computer speakers on by any chance?
No, I muted them.
Oh, okay.
There's some feedback coming in.
Okay. Sorry about that. Might be somebody else who is on speaker.
Yeah, if you, just to interrupt you, Laura, if you are listening in on the phone, please turn your speakers down or mute them for your PC so we don't get that feedback.
All right. Thanks, Brian. So I just want to acknowledge a handful of contributors that have helped share impacts and different reports from around the region, especially Ada Montague in Montana and Adnan Akuz in North Dakota. They've both been pretty key in collecting information from both their states. I know Adnan's on the call here today. But several others from Weather Service and state agencies and Extension and many others have kind of helped piece all the drought story here together and contributed to the Drought Monitor process, which you'll hear about from Brian here in a few minutes. I would like to add to, not to steal Brian's thunder at all, but if you have some drought reports or information you'd like to share to the Drought Monitor process, I encourage you to work through Ada, Adnan, or myself, or any of these other partners there on the screen to share that and make sure it gets acknowledged and used in the Drought Monitor process. So here we are. This is the Drought Monitor as of last week anyway. I think most of you know, but just to say again, it's updated every Thursday morning. So it will be updated tomorrow again already. And I wanted to zoom in here just on the Northern Plains region. This is the same region as the USDA Climate Hub here in the Northern Plains. But certainly this is the epicenter of drought, so to speak, in the nation right now. And we've seen rapid onset of severe drought impacts. As I said, mostly in the agricultural sector. We haven't seen much yet in widespread water restrictions or not very many irrigation cutoffs, anything like that just yet. So it really has affected our producers in the region. And I'll try to tell the story a little bit here, but you can see on the right there, there's a table. And when you do view these maps, you can see a little history of what the current percentages of drought are. So right now, D1 to D4 is over 21% of the region. So about a fifth of the region in drought of some level. And you can compare that to 3 months ago, for example, whereas about 13% of the region was in drought. So you can kind of see the progression over time. And here's another way to look at that on a national scale. Here again is at the National Drought Mitigation Center's website. And this is the change in just the last month in drought classes or drought severity in the region. And some of the areas in our states of Montana and Dakotas have had 3-class degradation over a single month, and that's very rapid considering it's only updated once a week. And with 1 category a week, let's say, that's quite a rapid change over that short time. So certainly this is really rapid moving drought situation. A lot of this has been really great to hear the impacts. Not great in that they're good impacts, but we're getting a lot of feedback from county extension staff, producers, the commodity groups in all the states, and the federal folks too, and FSA, Farm Service Agency, and NRCS. They've been really great on helping report impacts across the region, and that really helps tell the story of the severity of drought. So these examples here on the left, this is one I got through the state climatologist in North Dakota, but I believe it was a county ag agent who sent that picture of winter wheat in North Dakota, which is really tough, with his coffee mug in the picture there. Picture on the right is from a producer in South Dakota showing spring wheat that was failed. And those are tractor tires, obviously, but really short there. That's from South Dakota wheat. I got that picture. And these are pretty typical of what we've seen, widespread failures in both winter wheat, which is planted in the fall, and spring wheat. And I know there's been, tens of thousands of acres at least that have been deemed failed wheat that has been cut for hay or sprayed in the hopes that they can plant again to another crop sometime yet this season. And so I think the wheat and small grains has been probably one of the largest impacts we've seen, as the two Dakotas and Montana produce about 45% of the nation's wheat crop. And I think I forgot to put in the graph here, but the crop condition in spring wheat this year is worse than at this time of year than the last previous 10, 15 years or so. So it's really, really tough situation out there for those crops. But that's not to say those are the only reported impacts we've had. Several counties have burn bans in place. I've heard discussion of potential fireworks bans as we're getting close to the 4th of July. Cattle sales, including cow-calf pairs, which indicates that there's a lot of herd culling going on. Livestock illnesses, including like dust pneumonia from feeding in lots instead of setting out to pasture. And speaking of pasture, a lot of reduced growth in the pasture hay and forages. I know some areas in the central part of our state along the Missouri River haven't even taken a first cutting on alfalfa. So it's really hitting those folks pretty hard. Even the corn and soybeans, the later planted spring, or I guess the spring planted crops. I just drove from Aberdeen down to Rapid City and back this week, and you can see those thin stands and uneven emergence across a lot of the corn and soybean fields, despite some of the recent rain we've had of an inch or two. Poor livestock water quality, that's something that we saw early on, and was one of the first indicators, I think, this spring, at least in northwestern South Dakota, southwestern North Dakota, and that's something that they can haul in water for, but that was one of the leading indicators this year. And then also there's a lot of county declarations of drought by county commissions across the region, trying to see what else support or help they can get from the state and federal groups as well. So this is just kind of a snapshot of the impacts that we've seen here across our region. All right. Just to look back a little bit, what kind of set the stage for the drought? I spent the day yesterday in a room of crop advisors and ag advisors, and they really hit home the point of a really late fall freeze on part of our areas last fall. And this is the average date there of the 28-degree or hard freeze from the Midwest Regional Climate Center. Anything blues are September, greens, October. Those are typical dates of first fall freeze there. You can kind of see where you might be on the map down there. And here, as of mid-November of last year, this is where we're at. So a lot of frost dates where, at least a few weeks later than usual. So we had, especially in that winter wheat crop, a lot of bonus growing time there in the fall that depleted a lot of the soil moisture reserves and kind of dried things out before we got into the winter season. I know a lot of the areas along the North Dakota-South Dakota border had quite substantial snow over the winter, but that proved to be pretty limited relief and did not really help the soil moisture situation very much, as it turned out. And so I think this is one of the key factors that we sometimes forget, the impact of fall weather or climate on a drought here in the spring season. And then looking here just at the current year-to-date, departure from average temperature, and you see anything in the warm colors, yellows to reds, above average for the year so far. Obviously, this is a 6-month period almost, so it covers up a lot of ups and downs that we've had. Certainly the really warm February was notable, and then the heat that we've seen even in June here really have punctuated this period. Looking at the rainfall, this is percent of average rainfall. So 100% would be right at average rainfall. So anything in the warm colors is below average. Anything in the cool colors above average. So we see our area here, again, eastern Montana and the western Dakotas especially, looking 50% or less of average rainfall in that red color there for the last 5 months or so. And certainly that's been, a really substantial factor here in our current drought situation. So that we started off with some slightly warm temperatures, but also dry. And then just looking at the last month, so I had showed a little earlier, the Drought Monitor has gotten several categories worse, 3 categories worse in some of these areas, and a lot of that's happened in the last month. And so here, this is departure from average temperature just for the last 30 days. And you can see some of those really dark red areas, 3 to 5 degrees above average for the last month. I know here in Aberdeen, we hit 100 degrees on June 2nd, which was quite exceptional. And I know Fargo also was in the upper 90s that same day. So it's been quite warm here lately, and that's really exacerbated or made worse the dryness that we had just to start with. And here, this is the dryness, looking at percent of average rainfall for the last 30 days. Certainly no big surprise there. A lot of areas less than 50% of average. In what is a critical month, May and June, in a lot of our areas can be, 40% of our annual rainfall. And these 2 months are really critical, and we're falling behind rapidly with each passing week, as I know many of you know. But that's really hitting, again, our agricultural sector pretty hard. So looking ahead, I didn't show the 6 to 10 day, just in the interest of time, outlook, but this is an 8 to 14 day outlook, and quite a change in what I've kind of been watching. We are going to be leaning cooler than average, after this heat that we're seeing here this week. I know we're going to see highs in the 60s maybe at the end of the 70s, 60s here at the end of this week, but looks like that will be gradually moving off to our east and over the next 8 to 14 days. And then moisture-wise, there's some likelihood of leaning wetter than average there 8 to 14 days from now. So this would be starting next week this time. So far they've been showing drier up until that point. So maybe cross fingers, we might see a little shift in the moisture pattern here across our region. But this is probably the most optimistic I've seen on moisture here for a little while. And then I wanted to show again show to you the July outlook. This is from, again, the Climate Prediction Center. This was released last Thursday, and pretty much leaning towards more likely warmer than average conditions in July, with the exception of some parts of most of Montana, actually. But the Dakotas still more likely to lean warmer in the month of July, as is true for most of the country. Precipitation, on the other hand, in July, kind of a mixed bag across our region, but it does seem somewhat optimistic there. Eastern Montana, northwestern North Dakota has some increased probability of being wetter in July. Crossing fingers again that I hope that does verify, does end up being true. I think we could use it. Although I know that we have some real substantial impacts already that we can't reverse, like some of the wheat situation and the cattle sales and so on. And then just to end out the summer, looking quite a ways out, but looking at July, August, and September overall, if you kind of clump those 3 months, again, leaning warmer than average for most of the country, except for Montana, which has equal chances of warmer, cooler, or near average. So that's, again, looking at all 3 of those months together, July through September. And here's maybe the most optimistic, the most good news I can share with you, in that it looks currently anyway to lean wetter than average towards the mid to late summer, July through September, across much of our region that's experiencing drought right now. This would be really great news, I'm sure, for soybean producers if they can get their crop to go that far. August is really critical time for moisture, especially in that crop. Hopefully it could also set the stage for winter wheat planting there at the end of the season as well, in the early fall. So hoping this verifies as well and rings true for most of our region with a wetter than average probability across our region. Here's, I know several links here, but I know the PDF will be shared and this webinar will be shared. So I wanted to put several different ways to connect with folks here, starting with the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. That's drought.gov, our drought portal for the nation. This Drought Impact Reporter, the second link there, that's a great place. If you have pictures to share, reports of drought impacts, we'd love to see them there at that website. And then several other ways to connect with regional climate centers, South Dakota, North Dakota. Towards the end there are just some ways to connect with me personally on Facebook and Twitter and Extension. But again, I encourage you to reach out to Adnan Acus in North Dakota, Ada Montague, or any of the National Weather Service offices in your area as well for drought information. So with that, I'm hoping that you see skies like this pretty soon and get some rain across the region. This is a picture from our farm here in Aberdeen. And I'd like to, I think, Doug, are we taking questions now or passing right off to Brian?
We're gonna wait on questions just for a moment. One thing I do want to reiterate is if you haven't put your name, your association or institution or whatever, what you do for a living, and a contact information into the chat chamber or chat room, please do so. We have a number of people who have done that already, and if you haven't, we'd really like to know who got on this, and maybe so that we can send you a follow-up message if we're going to have more of these in the future, which is something we can discuss at the end. The other thing I guess I will say before we go to Brian is that I know for sure on July 20th, which is quite a ways from now, and a lot can happen from a drought perspective, we will be having another sort of region-wide. It won't be so concentrated on the Dakotas, but it may be the main story, unfortunately, if that's going on. But there is a regional, much broader sort of north-central part of the U.S. Webinar that we do, much like this, in which state climatologists and others do briefings to sort of get people caught up on what's going on. If you want to be a part of that, there are places to go sign up. You can contact Laura or Brian or anybody else on this to find out how to do that, or myself, and it's simply my name, doug.cluck@noaa.gov, and that's KLUCK. Brian, why don't you take over? And we, like I said, we'll do some questions at the end. So remember your questions, write them down or whatever, and we will we'll get to those. So let's see if this thing pops up on my end. It's loading. Brian's going to talk about the Drought Mitigation Center. And Brian, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, can everyone see a new set of slides?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, Doug. And I think Laura did a good job of setting up the stage of kind of what we've been seeing here as of late. And the rapid development of drought is not something that has been out of the realm. The last few years, we have had several episodes where drought tended to develop quite rapidly. And also, as Laura mentioned, sometimes we can relate the impacts and kind of what we're seeing back to what was happening maybe a season or two prior. So going back to the fall and that seeing that it isn't just the recent dryness, but it is coupled with some other impacts. So just to introduce myself, my name is Brian Fuchs. I am a climatologist and faculty member here at the National Drought Mitigation Center and the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And what I'm going to talk about here this morning is an introduction to what we have on the U.S. Drought Monitor webpage. Laura went over some of the products already. I have a couple I'm going to show as well. And then quickly I'm going to go through the process that we go through each week of making the U.S. Drought Monitor. I am one of 11 current authors, and so I'll do my best to kind of walk you through that process of what we do and what we analyze each week in putting together the map. So first off, I wanted to introduce you. Let me get my screen going like that. And are you seeing the screen or the presenter screen?
The whole thing. So
okay, good. That's what I wanted. So just to give you an idea of where to go and get this information. A lot of times you see the map but don't really know where to go. So this is the launching pad for the U.S. Drought Monitor and all the associated data and products. So you can go to droughtmonitor.unl.edu, and from there we have some tabs up there at the top, and if you click on each one or hover over them, you're going to get some drop-down menus. And from those menus, I've put stars by some of the most frequently requested data or products that people are looking for. And so on the maps and data, we do have a map archive. Every weekly map going back to 2000 is available. We also have some change maps, different regions, different views. You can get state views, regional views, etc. If you're into GIS and you want to bring in some data and start looking at this with your own overlays, or you want to add some additional features that maybe we don't provide, we do have the GIS data available, and you can go and download that. If you're building web pages or putting together tools and you want to send people to the most recent data or some historical data even, the Maps and Data Services allows you to set up direct URL links to products that we serve up. And so you can put them in one time, and they'll change each week as the map is updated. And for those of you in the livestock and grazing end of things, the FSA eligibility tool will allow you to put in your grazing period, your start and stop date, and it will tell you based on the most current farm bill what your eligibility status is with relation to the livestock forage production program. Under supplemental information, we have current conditions, there's forecast data, historical weather data, and some links that can take you to a lot more than what we even provide. And then in the About the U.S. Drought Monitor tab, a couple of them that I really like is the classification scheme. It really talks about how we get to these different drought intensity levels and what we look at in doing so. And a lot of times you really don't know what the Drought Monitor is, and so we've put together a little brochure that describes what this tool is, what goes into it, who all the players are, and how we get this done each week. And even on this page, you can see that alongside the map on the right-hand side, there is a narrative. So along with the map each week, the author will put together a narrative that describes what's going on in the various parts of the country, and at the very end there is a short looking ahead section which does include some forecast information. So not only does the map come out each week, but that narrative does as well. We're pretty transparent through this process, and we want to keep it that way. We want people to be able to find us and contact us. So all the Drought Monitor authors are available under that About the U.S. Drought Monitor tab, and I've provided the URL there as well. So you can contact us via email or phone number directly. So if you see the author's name on the map and you have a specific question about that map, go ahead and call or email that author, and they'll be glad to let you know what their reasoning was or what data they were looking at, etc. And if you want to just send a general question or comment, or if you have some information on problems that you're experiencing in your region, Laura mentioned the Drought Impact Reporter. You can also contact the Drought Monitor authors through that generic email address that I have circled there in red. That will get you get what you want to send out to us. Maybe you have some photos, maybe you have some information, maybe comments or questions on the map. Send it out there, and that will get out to the right person, and pretty much can guarantee you're going to get a response back in a day or so, if not sooner, by sending that in. And there's also some social media links there at the bottom that you can look into as well. And we also have this Drought Monitor update that comes out each week. Say you're in the media or you just want to get an email each week telling you, hey, the new map is out there. You can sign up there, and that's going to get that new map out to you every Thursday morning. You're going to get an email, and that will get across your desk. So the U.S. Drought Monitor, how are we putting this together? Well, back in 1999, the idea came about that, hey, we need a way of analyzing drought for the country, and some folks sat down and decided on what would become the U.S. Drought Monitor as the method that this would be done. This is not just a National Drought Mitigation Center product. This is done in an equal partnership with NOAA and USDA. All three of us come together each week to put this together, and we rotate the responsibility of making the map amongst the 11 authors. We do have a Western Regional Climate Center author that came on board, actually took the spot when Laura came back to South Dakota. We take into account not just precipitation, but a lot of different information, a lot of different indicators to put together the analysis each week. And that's really what I'm going to talk about as I go forward. And in doing so, it's kind of unique that it is a combination of both objective and subjective data, as we have 450 to 500 experts that participate in this process each week by providing information to their state climatologist or through a drought task force or an organized regional call. And all that information gets across our desk each week, and it's very helpful in putting together the analysis. So as Laura stated, here is the most current map. It will be updated tomorrow morning. And what I wanted to do was highlight what I have circled there. This is a national product and focuses on broad-scale conditions. Local conditions may vary, and see the accompanying text for forecast statements. So even though we have the ability to drill down and see a state and see the counties, it really is dictated by the types of data and the density of data that are available for any particular area. And again, you may see conditions at a sub-county level or even at a ranch scale that it's such a fine scale that it's very hard for a national product to pick up. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear about issues that are at that scale, but sometimes it is very hard to show under the data that we have on a national scale. And again, here we have the Northern Plains Climate Hub. As Laura mentioned, we have seen some quite rapidly developing drought. And if you think about where we were going back to the start of the water year, we were just under 4% of this region in drought, or excuse me, 14% of this region in drought. So it has increased, but a year ago we were only seeing about 5%. Most of that was confined to western South Dakota. So compared to where we were a year ago to where we are now, we have seen quite a bit of development. And again, that has been rapidly more of a flash drought type of development here in the last month or so. And so this weekly comparison does tell the story, and you can do this for multiple regions. You can select regions and the type of data you want to look at. So I just chose to look at the current map for this week, comparing it to June 14th of 2016. And again, we can see that dryness last year that was in northeast Wyoming and western South Dakota. But for the most part, the rest of the region, we had some pockets of dryness in Montana and some drought in Montana and some dryness over the Midwest. But for the north central region as a whole, last year we only had about 2.5% of this region in drought, and this year we're at 12%. So quite a bit of difference a year makes. You can really see that some of these areas, especially in parts of Wyoming and South Dakota, have been really under the gun, so to speak, for the last year or so. These change maps are great. We just even had some discussion this morning on the U.S. Drought Monitor Listserv of how rapidly some of these areas have been changing. And so just for this Climate Hub region over the last month, we've seen areas that have had 2 or 3 class degradations. And again, the new map coming out tomorrow potentially will even build upon that. So we'll have to wait and see what that looks like. But for the most part, you can see through North and South Dakota and eastern Wyoming that we have had some rapid changes, some flash drought events developing here on a very short-term scale. And to get into the outlook a little bit, you know, this comes out the third Thursday of every month, and it is the seasonal drought outlook that goes out right now through the end of September. And what it's showing is in the areas in green, drought removal is potentially likely. Again, this is based off of what the Climate Prediction Center has seen in their models. And in that grayish area, it says drought remains but improves. So right now, looking at thinking about some of the products that Laura showed through the rest of the summer and where we currently sit, it's saying that by the end of September, we're seeing some improvement in this region. So I guess that bodes well for the longer term, even though the short term may be a little more dicey, so to speak. There's also a monthly drought outlook that comes out at the end of each month, and so here in a couple weeks we will have a monthly drought outlook for July that will focus in just on that 1 month period, and it'll be interesting to see what that looks like for this region and if we still see the same type of story. So when we sit back and look at all this stuff, a lot of times people want to know, again, how is all this done? So what goes into getting this drought information out each week? And it is quite complex. So first off, I talked about the authoring group. So we have these authoring groups split between NDMC, NOAA, and USDA. And you can see that we have 3 authors in Washington, D.C. within the Climate Prediction Center, 2 at USDA within the Office of the Chief Economist. There's 3 out in Asheville, North Carolina within the National Center for Environmental Information. There's 2 here in Lincoln at the NDMC, and then there's 1 out in Reno at the Desert Research Institute. So these are the current 11 authors. We typically will do a 2-week shift, and then we pass it on to the next person. After 2 weeks, basically, as an author speaking from experience, I'm ready to pass it on. Those 2 weeks are quite intense that we analyze the entire country between Monday and Wednesday and getting that map out each Thursday. To be an author, you need to work in one of the regional or national centers, either in a governmental or academia type of setting. So here are the objectives when the Drought Monitor was developed. This was what was intended the map be. So the first objective was the map is going to be an assessment of current conditions and current impacts. The U.S. Drought Monitor is not a model. Each week that author is going in and manually moving those lines based on the newest and latest data, as well as the feedback from the local experts and the impacts that they're reporting. We're not putting all these data into some kind of model and it's spitting out the map. That we're going in and each one of those lines has a purpose, and we are moving them each week with a purpose. The U.S. Drought Monitor is not just interpreting precipitation. A lot of times people come back and say, hey, this is how much rain we've had. And again, drought is going to be really driven by the amount of precipitation or lack of precipitation an area has. But we're also taking into account many other indicators, looking at some satellite data, river and stream flow data, groundwater level, soil moisture data, and a lot of other information I'm going to touch on here later in the slide. So it's not just a precipitation interpretation. The U.S. Drought Monitor is not a forecast or a drought declaration. I showed you the seasonal drought outlook. There is a associated forecast product that starts with what is on the U.S. Drought Monitor, but it is an assessment of current conditions, not looking forward at all. And as far as drought declarations go, each state, their governor declares drought for their state or for a portion of their state. They may use the U.S. Drought Monitor to help guide that decision, but it is not an official drought declaration of any kind. We look at impacts on the map. A lot of you will notice that we have those letters on the map, S's and L's, or a combination of an S and L. This is where we're identifying short and long-term issues or a combination of both. In our world, short-term impacts are generally a time scale of 6 months or less, where long-term impacts are generally anything from 6 months to out to several years. In some instances, we have longer-term impacts and short-term impacts being experienced at the same time, and that's where you'll see that S and L. We try to incorporate that local information where it's made available to us. Like I said, we communicate through an email list server. We have over 350 people subscribed right now, and out of those 350, if you count the people that they're talking with, that network or web goes out to 500 or 600 people at any given week that are providing information into the process. We try to be as objective as possible. As an author, I don't get any special reward for showing less drought or more drought. I want to show a map that if anyone calls me up, I'm able to describe what I did, the data I looked at, and show the science behind it. The physical data and indicators must support the depiction on the map. We can't just put in D3 because people say, hey, it's D3. We need to show that, yes, the data supports D3, the impacts support D3, and we're able to do that. The impact data validates the physical data, so sometimes there may be a disconnect between the impacts and the data, and other times they match up quite nicely. But in essence, that data on the ground, that impact information, validates the information that we're using to put the map together. And we have this convergence of evidence approach. I like to relate it to a law trial where each side puts out all their evidence and the jury at the end has to come up with a solution. And that's kind of what my job as an author is. All the data is presented to me, all the impact and feedback from the field is presented to me, and I got to see where all that converges to, what that drought level is and why it's at that level and why I can support it on the map. So this convergence of evidence approach is quite unique in that we are looking at many different indicators and inputs, and we got to see what the full story is. And in the drought monitor world, these indicators and indices don't always line up nicely and just say a single story. They're over a broad spectrum of different intensity levels, and that's where the experience and knowledge of the drought monitor author, along with the people in the field, gets the map as hopefully as good as we can get it each week. So the authors need to look at all the data, but we don't believe in one piece of the data. So we can look through all the different variables, but we don't say, hey, this one indicator is showing it as good or as bad as it can be, and we put all our weight on that one piece of data. We look at everything. In different times of the year, you may look at different types of data as well. And I can't stress it enough. The impacts on the ground are very important to know, and the network of people providing that information is vital to this process. So you see the different drought intensity levels on the map, the D0 through D4. D0 is not considered drought. The D1, 2, 3, and 4 categories are considered drought. Typically, abnormally dry is used in instances where drought is developing and we're kind of putting a heads up on it, or if you've had a drought episode that's recovering, sometimes there are lingering issues even though after the rains and precipitation have returned and we start seeing improvement through the region. So abnormally dry conditions may be used to identify those lingering impacts and issues. So the advantages of using percentiles, it can be applied to any parameter, meaning that as we look at these different inputs into the drought monitor, we're able to rank them from driest reading to wettest reading or lowest value to highest value, and then we can break them into these percentiles, which tells us exactly where they fall into the drought monitor categories. So to be an abnormally dry, that's saying that the majority of the indicators are falling in the driest or lowest 21st to 30th percentile. And that's based on the entire history or record for that data for that particular location. For D1, when you start getting into the drought, that's saying that the majority of the indicators are falling into the 11th or 20th percentile. For D2, they're falling into the 6th to 10th percentile. For D3, they're falling into the 3rd to 5th percentile. And D4, they're falling into the 1st or 2nd percentile. So that's saying for D4, that's about a 1 in 50 to a 100-year event, where D3 is falling into that 25 to 30-year event. To just show drought on the map, you need to be in a top 20 driest or drought event for the entire history for that region. And, you know, this is why we do it. If you look at the north central region here at the top for the history of the Drought Monitor, and for South Dakota as a state below, just two examples of how drought can be variable. And you can see that ebb and flow over time. And, you know, can we really relate current conditions here in 2017 to what we saw in the early 2000s, or in South Dakota is the drought of 2012 into 2013 similar to what we saw last year in western South Dakota? And the reason we use these percentiles is it takes the human nature out of the observations. A lot of times human nature thinks that the last drought episode was the worst on record because that's the one you remember, that's the one you've had to deal with the most. And when you use percentiles, it takes that human nature, that anecdotal or subjective nature out of it by saying, you know, hey, it has to be D4, it's really, really dry, or I don't remember it being this dry. But when we use the full period of record of data, we're actually able to go in and analyze it and say, yeah, it is a top 5 event. This should be D3 in this region, or however we're classifying a region at that point in time. And so for these percentiles, this is just a quick graphic explaining at how we can put this out there. So we have 100 years of precipitation record, just one variable for one location. And you can see that to be D4, you're only looking at those 2 dry events that in this case fell in 2012 and 1940. When you get to D3, you pick up 3 more events. Oh, sorry, my slide advanced. When you get to D3, you pick up 3 more events. When you get to D2, you pick up 5 more events. So to be D2, D3, or D4, you're only talking about the top 10 events out of all of those that are listed that you're even looking at. And then to get into D1, or just the other drought, to just be in drought, out of 100 events, you're only talking 20 of the 100 that we're even considering. You got to think that drought is one of the rare events that when you look at the precipitation distribution or the data distribution for an area, on the dry side, we're only focusing on the tail of that distribution to be really shown on the U.S. Drought Monitor. And when you look at that near normal, that 31st to 100 percentile, that's where the majority of the data are falling in. So what kind of data are we looking at? When the U.S. Drought Monitor was comprised and put together, we only had a handful of indicators that were coming in each week that we could look at, and most of those were on a coarse climate division or crop reporting scale. But over time, data has developed, and we've developed along with it. So in any given week, we're looking at drought indices, such as the Standardized Precipitation Index or the Palmer. There's many others that are playing into this. Soil moisture. Some states are actually observing soil moisture, while others are not, and so we do use a combination of both observed and soil moisture models, and there are several soil moisture models out there that we look at different depths as well. On the hydrological side, we do look at stream flow and river data from the USGS. We have well data and groundwater level that's coming in from individual state networks, and this is vital to keeping track of that water supply in the region and water availability. Remote sensing is something that's really come on in the last several years. There are more and more products being developed using satellite information such as VegDry and QuickDry, ESI, different types of products. And the advantage of remote sensing is they're very high resolution, so you can really see those changes at that county and sub-county level. The drawback to some of the remotely sensed data is it doesn't have a long period of record, only as long as some of those satellites have been up there. The expert local input and impacts is again, about the 5th time I've mentioned it. This is vital to this process. hearing from the locals, the state networks that have been established, the regional networks that have been established. They're feeding up a ton of information to the U.S. Drought Monitor authors and helping us with that analysis. And they're picking up things that maybe we're not seeing in the data and maybe directing our eyes to maybe dig in a little bit deeper in some areas that just don't obviously show up when we're looking at all the information each week. And again, precipitation and snow. You know, most people, you ask them what drought is, well, it's not, it's when it rains. And again, precipitation plays into a lot of the other variables on this chart that I'm showing. And so it is the backbone of a lot of where this observation comes from. In any given week, we are looking at 40 to 50 unique indicators over unique time scales and creating the U.S. Drought Monitor map. Not all areas are represented equally by all pieces of data, depending on how those networks of data points are developed and dispersed around the country. So just to jump in this a little bit more, some of the indicators we look at, again, some of the drought indices there on the left, the stream flow information. We're using some radar-based precipitation estimates. Other data which are available where states have their own mesonets, we're using that data as well. Really is bringing in more localized data to help that localized situation. During the growing season, there's some specific indices and indicators that we look at during that time. And out in the western U.S., we're looking at a lot of snow-related information as that snowpack and then the melt-off and the storage of that water is vital to how drought is looked at and analyzed out in the western half of the U.S. And again, the local and regional feedback into this process is vital. Like I've mentioned, there's regional climate centers that have been very helpful, not only in organizing data for us, but some data-specific products that they serve up each day. The state climatologists, a lot of them have been very active in developing their own state networks or coordinating with other states, like we see here in the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming, to really get those issues across their state boundaries accurately depicted. As the Drought Monitor author, a lot of times we don't even have those boundaries on when we're drawing the map. We're looking at the data by itself, we're moving the contours, so I don't really know if I moved a line along the South Dakota and North Dakota border into either one of those states because I don't even have that on. I'm just looking at the data and adjusting according to that. So when these state climate offices can coordinate with each other and bring in some of the other partners as well, it really helps us to get a well-rounded depiction for a region. There's Native American tribal input as well. This is an area that we could increase more observations and more feedback from the tribal lands. CoCoRaHS is part of this process. NIDIS with their different pilot regions is huge. And then, again, some of these states have developed their own network or multi-state networks. And I know I'm leaving some off this list, but a lot of people are coming together to really help this weekly USDM process evolve and continue. And I talked about the listserv, so as of June 13th, the last time I updated the number, at least in the STAR, we had 432 people subscribed. So from last August to June, we added a little over 40 people net, and that some people do drop off, but about a 40-person net increase since last summer, and I'll update the map again here in August. But you can see there's a lot of different people participating, and you see that number 4 out in Montana. Well, Ada has her own network that she's reaching out to, and they're providing a lot of information. So even that number 4 is misleading because we know there's a lot more people, and just using Montana as an example, that's going on in many other states as well. So we heard about NIDIS and the National Integrated Drought Information System. Well, this is the national portal for drought information at drought.gov. You can come here, you can get all sorts of information. It'll bring you back to the Drought Monitor and some of those associated tools. I saw some of the Outlook of information as well, and you can get there at drought.gov. But then in the Missouri River Basin, in that drought early warning system, or the DEWS as we call it, for the Missouri River Basin, they have their own web portal on drought.gov, and here's the link to that. And there's information that's very refined for that region. that can be navigated through and found at that page, as well as some contact information for who the stakeholders and players are in that region. And here at the NDMC, we have many partners that we work with, and just listing a few of them here, from NIDIS to SCIP to NOAA to USDA, University of Nebraska as well. And with that, I think we are ready for some questions. I'll put up my contact information here quickly as we transition to that. And thank you all for participating today and listening in.
Thank you very much, Brian and Laura. If I haven't already thanked you already, we do have a number of questions on the chat that we're going to try to get to here real quick. One thing that occurred to me while I was listening to this is whether we should do this again in a couple weeks. So, you know, the Drought Outlook comes out, as Brian said, every Thursday, every week, every Thursday, like
Well, the Drought Monitor does. Not the Outlook.
Yeah, I don't mean Outlook. Gosh, did I say that?
Yes.
Sorry. The Monitor comes out, which is recording what's actually happening on the ground to some degree, comes out every week. And so, you know, my initial thoughts were doing this again in about 2 weeks, and then maybe instead of talking just about the Drought Monitor, we talk also about ag impacts more extensively, and also have a sort of climate weather wrap-up either before or after that. So if that's something you all are interested in, you know, feel free to chat about it or say, yeah, let's do this again in a couple of weeks. Now, nobody, you know, we are looking at cooler temperatures, the potential for some precipitation in some areas. You know, if it rains like heck for the next 2 weeks, we'll all be very happy, and we won't have to get together again. Now, I know that a lot of damage is already done, et cetera. So for now, we'll put it on the calendar, maybe the week of July 4th, probably if we can get the right people on board, the 6th or 7th of July to do this again. And so now let's go to some questions people had. One of the first ones that I saw, and feel free, Laura or Brian, to bring up other questions that you're seeing. I may not see everything. Is that what was trying to bring it? Well, the question was, is El Nino or La Nina or some other driving force very recognizable in terms of this drought in the northern plains? Is there something that we should be keying this to? And that's a very, very hard question. And Brian, why don't you, or Laura, why don't you try and sort that out?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, we are not seeing the strong influence of any ENSO signal. And so I don't think that there is a direct relationship to that being a driving force right now. I have been following the talk of a potential El Nino development later this summer, maybe into the fall, and that's even kind of tampered out a little bit. So the short answer is no, we really haven't been under any ENSO influence here as of late.
Yeah, and go ahead, Laura.
Oh, yeah, I would just add, though, long-term trends. We've seen warmer winters. That's the season where we see the strongest warming in this region, and surely we've seen that the last couple winters, so that could be a factor. But, yeah, as far as El Nino, La Nina, that kind of thing, I don't know that we can really point to that this year.
Yeah, by and large, again, there's no one thing. And we were talking, and somebody else made a comment about how the heavy snow cover, especially across central, maybe western North Dakota this year, really didn't allow that the ground to freeze deeply. And so when it did melt, it sort of it went into the soil as opposed to across, you know, it didn't run off or something like that into a lot of places that it normally would. Anyway, yeah, so El Nino, La Nina play a part, but they're not necessarily everything. There's several things: antecedent conditions, what happened last fall, what happened during the winter, what happens in May and June, obviously, as Laura commented on how much precipitation you should be getting on average during that time of year, and you depend on it for crops and things like that. If you don't get it, it's trouble, right?
I see the next question from Tom Doring. Is there a correlation between the loss of CRP acres down to a 25-year low and drought impacts? Tom, I think that's a great question, and I don't have an answer to that. If anyone has done any preliminary work on the loss of CRP and the development of drought, that would be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Tom, if you mean loss of production of CRP acres or a reduction in the enrollment of CRP acres. I think part of that is an economic driver as well, not just drought or climate. So there's another question there from Mike up closer to the top there about snow in North Dakota in November, December, and what that may have meant for spring crops and pastures. And I know there's some SDSU researchers and natural resources who have looked into the effect of snow, and they found that even if you have a lot of snow in the winter, it doesn't really benefit a whole lot in cool season grasses. That really April moisture, maybe early May, is really much more important than however much snow you have. And I'm not sure the reasons for that, but that's what we found here in South Dakota anyway.
Okay. What are the thoughts on increasing fire danger in grasslands with the drought? I think it's pretty clear that I'm on a couple lists that show, especially in South Dakota, BIA takes a very close look at those things and monitors it very closely. And I know that they're somewhat worried about drying conditions and such. But Laura, do you have any other comments about fire danger now or for the rest of the year?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. I know our state fire meteorologist was on the line, Darren Calabo from the School of Mines in Rapid City. But he and I have visited, and even in the worst drought years of recent history, in June we just don't see huge fires in June, but we do see the start of a lot of little fires in those fine fuels, grasses, a lot of small fire starts potentially. Where we'll may see some of those large fires would be later summer and the fall. For example, the Cottonwood fire in South Dakota last year, burned 41,000 acres. That's a pretty big fire in South Dakota. So we see that usually later season this time of year. We don't see those really big fires, but certainly I know Bureau of Indian Affairs and our state wildland fire, and I know a lot of others in other states are keeping an eye on it. There's several burn bans in place in counties as well, mostly for those fine fuels like grasses right now that are dried. I don't know if you want to open up to Darren to answer that again or what you would like to do there, Doug.
Yeah, well, Darren's actually typing something in as we speak. Or he's speaking, either way. I don't know who has control of the...
I think the phones are live that if you want to unmute and participate in any of the questions or discussions, that should be open. I don't think we've been muted.
Darren, do you want to say something, and we'll see if we hear you.
Doug and Laura, this is Dave Martin with the Great Plains Region BIA.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Oh, hey, Dave.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and add my take on that as Darren's trying to unmute there. But you hit it right on, Laura, as far as timing. Our large fire impacts in the last 8 years that I've been here and going back 10 years in our fire history has always been a spring fire season, talking about late March, April, May. We have some large fires that have been recorded in the last 10 years in that realm. But last year and in 2012, we had the Freeman fire over in Pine Ridge last July. We had a D1 moderate level drought in play at that time, and that was a lightning strike fire. That went 18,000 plus acres, and that was the first week in July. But June is usually enough green up that we have enough green up that typically we don't have any really large fires. June timeline, like you alluded to, Laura. But July and August and September, October are critical for large fire if we have any drought in play in our regional area, and also the spring, which is late March, April, May. Timing of the rain, just like you said, Laura, is critical. We can get a ton of snow, like what happened in North Dakota this year, but they're extremely dry and they're starting to pick up fires, and they're starting to get a little larger. And we're also getting lightning strike fires in the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River Indian Reservation corridors as well right now. Typically in my 10-year research going back in our fire history, when we start picking up lightning strike fires and they're propagating and expanding and growing, not large, but actually growing in the grass, that's typical of drought indicators that are in play on the ground. In an averagely wet year, we don't have issues with lightning strike fires. But now that we are starting to get that in two of our reservations in the central part of the Dakotas. So I just wanted to add that on as far as what you had said earlier, Laura, as far as drought and fire growth, large fire growth in June.
That's very helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Darren, did you want to say anything? I see you dialed back in.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was listening on my machine. You know, really, it's a longitudinal issue in South Dakota. Western South Dakota sees high fire activity in late June going into early July if those months see well above average temperatures. Drought conditions aren't necessarily a huge factor for large wildland fire growth in the Black Hills National Forest. You do need some precipitation deficits, but it's really those high temperatures that drive big fires within that ponderosa pine dominated ecosystem. When we start getting out into the prairies, yeah, David kind of hit the nail on the head there. We do need drought conditions during the summer months. However, our largest fires on the prairie typically happen in those shoulder seasons when our grasses are seasonally cured anyways. So I think going out into late June, into early July, yeah, the fire potential is probably highest across the northwestern quarter of South Dakota. That just goes back into climatology and fire history. And as we get later into July and into August, the fire potential starts to increase across, say, central and northeastern South Dakota, but we still have to temper that idea of fire potential increase with the fact that you climatologically just don't see very large fires in that area to begin with. If we see a 60 or 100 acre fire in July across northeastern part of the state, that's a huge fire. So it's kind of relative to where everything's at.
Okay, thank you. Tom Doring is asking a question, or Doring is asking a question about lost CRP and the amount of CO2. And I don't think there's a direct there may be correlations, but I don't think it's necessarily a real correlation between the two, between the amount of water or how much is being held in the watersheds and all that, unless somebody has a different answer.
Yeah, Doug, I could add to that. I don't think there are enough acres of CRP to really make a substantial impact across the region. Like in South Dakota, we have only about 700,000 acres of CRP. So compared to the croplands, farmlands, that's not a lot of acres. So yeah.
Okay.
I see a question from Dennis Longknife. Our tribe would be interested in the ag impacts we will be facing, and also as a tribal community, we're interested in how the drought will affect our berry picking activities. Dennis, Laura did show that link to the Drought Impact Reporter, and it will come out, or you can search for Drought Impact Reporter on the National Drought Mitigation Center webpage. And there is an archive of about 10 years of impacts, so you could go into your area and see what impacts have developed during drought episodes in the past, and that's probably my best answer to you right now.
Yeah. Dennis is one of our partners that we've been working with at Fort Belknap. Okay. Has anybody seen any other questions, or anybody want to speak up and have any other questions?
Alyssa, how much reduction has there been in standing water pools like wetlands and lakes of varied sizes?
I can try to answer that. I think she's up here in Aberdeen. I mean, that prairie pothole landscape, all those kind of shallow water bodies in the region, we do see quite a lot of seasonal up and downs in those kinds of areas. But the really big lakes, I don't know that we've seen any substantial drop in lake levels there. So I don't know if there's anyone else here from Natural Resources that can answer that too, but that's kind of what I've seen.
So, sort of the dichotomy, if you will, or the unconventional sort of wisdom this year is that we have these coming out of the mountains, pretty full streams, and so the big reservoirs are pretty darn full. And then if you irrigate from some of those, there's generally speaking, a lot of water. It's when you get away from those water bodies that this drought is really impacting, and I think people on the phone probably already know that.